The way inflation is measured has just changed. If we take a look at the Consumer Price Index homepage on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, bls.gov, we see this banner at the top that says there is an update to the CPI weighting. Starting in January of this year, the Bureau of Labor Statistics updated the weights for the Consumer Price Index so that it's based on a single calendar year of data instead of what it used to be, which was 2 years of expenditure data. Now, this change makes many people extremely suspicious, given the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government organizations have a long history of skewing and manipulating data and changing exactly precisely what is measured in order to fit a specific narrative or serve someone's interests. This is why when we look at alternative measurements of inflation, we get some wildly different numbers. For example, shadowstats.com shows the inflation measured based on the old 1990 metrics, and that shows up currently at about 10% versus today's 6.5%. And even worse, if we go back to basing it off of the way it was measured in 1980, the inflation is measuring at about 14% right now. So what exactly was changed in this most recent update, and is it actually going to matter? Well, one change is that there's a higher importance on housing. The owner's equivalent rent now accounts for over a quarter of the total calculation. And instead, used car prices are now accounting for a smaller amount of the total basket. Now, this change, at least in the short term, is actually making the inflation numbers higher than they would be otherwise. This gives more fuel to the fire for the Fed to keep on fighting inflation and potentially spill us over into a hard landing and crash things, over tighten as a result of looking at data that might actually be higher than it should be. The other big change is that the CPI is based on a single year of data versus 2 years of data. Now let me explain this. The CPI is measured between two time frames normally. It's year over year and month over month. And that simply means what are prices right now versus what they were a year ago, and what are prices right now versus what they were a month ago. That's not changing here. This is talking about the weights of the items that are included in the basket. It used to look at a 2-year time frame. So it would look at 2 years and it would say, hey, people are buying this much chicken, people are buying iPhones, people are buying clothes, people are buying all this stuff, and that makes up the basket. Every 2 years, they'd go in there and say, hey, have consumer practices changed? And so we are maybe overweighting or underweighting things, measuring things that people aren't really buying anymore, that don't represent the average things that American household is going to be buying. But now, instead of looking back at 2 years worth of data to determine the weightings of the items in the basket, they're only looking at 1 year's worth of data. This means that that basket is going to be a little bit more dynamic moving forward, and the weightings will change a little bit more frequently. Now, you're probably wondering why in the world would they do this? Because anytime they're changing the way it's measured, you just are suspicious as to why, especially given the fact that the result of doing that over 40 years has been inflation is now understated compared to what it would have been otherwise. But here's the problem. You actually have to do this if you are going to measure inflation at all. Let's push it to the extreme and go all the way back to the 80s and look at some of the things that people were buying. Reader's Digest recently published an article about 31 things that everyone had in their house in the 80s. And this list includes things like Walkman cassette players, sewing machines, electric typewriters, Polaroid cameras, and more. Which means that if you never update the weighting or the items in the basket, you're going to be measuring the price of things that just don't get purchased anymore, which means that your measure would eventually become useless. And there are many other ways that they change how inflation is measured other than just the weightings and the items in the basket. One of the things they do is quality adjustment. So if something like men's pants and shorts they deem to be higher quality, they will have a hedonic adjustment to show deflation instead of inflation. Or if something like a range or a cooktop now has a digital display or is connected to the internet, you will have a higher quality for the dollars, and therefore this might show deflation instead of a higher price as well. Now, you can see both sides to this if you look at it objectively. Something like an iPhone costs you $500 to $1,000, And that replaces dozens of things that people used to have to buy on a continual basis. Just atlases alone, because you have free maps now everywhere you go. Not to mention the camcorder and the fax machine and the telephone and the cable TV and all the stuff that modern technology replaces at a fraction of the cost. So you do have to do some adjustment to the way you're measuring it to accurately capture what people are actually spending their money on and whether cost of living is going up considering the quality of life. But this is something that is so highly subjective and every person's experience is so different that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do accurately. Now, it's not like they're hiding this. You can look at all the changes they've made throughout all the years to the way that they measure inflation. But measuring inflation itself may not even be possible. Consider this scenario. It's Valentine's Day, so you walk into the store and you want to buy some nice ribeyes so you can cook a good dinner for a Valentine's Day dinner. But you look at the price per pound of these ribeyes and you think, you know what, that's a little bit steep. Instead, I'm going to go with chicken. I can marinate it, still make it taste good, but it's a lot cheaper. This scenario highlights the fact that consumer behavior is influenced by price changes, and then that consumer behavior that has changed means that prices now change, which means that steak would have continued to go up in price if consumer behavior never changed and they just kept on buying it at the higher and higher prices. But the fact that it went up meant consumer behavior changed, meaning that that demand for that steak went down, so the price stopped going up. So if you're measuring the steak, you're not going to get an accurate measure of inflation, even if you're also measuring the chicken. This is why many people, maybe yourself included, say that inflation and deflation refer to the money supply alone, because the money supply changing drives prices. And in fact, if you go back 100 years, when you look up the definition of inflation and deflation, you're going to find the definition of the money supply expanding or contracting. But because that usually results in prices changing over time, modern parlance changed, and now people just use inflation and deflation to refer to the average level of prices. Now, I personally think that it is more effective to use modern vernacular and not have to clarify with semantics every single time, oh, I'm actually using a definition that hasn't been used for 100 years. I think that's pointless. I'd rather meet them on their turf, use their definitions, and then we can have more of an effective conversation about what actually to do about it, rather than trying to go back and argue about what words really mean. Language changes over time. It always has, and it always will. And just like language changing, it looks like the CPI and the way it's measured will continue to change, just like it always has. So this most recent change that adjusts the basket every single year instead of looking back at the last 2 years, at least for now, is resulting in higher inflation numbers, which means the Fed will tighten even longer, at least until we see that hard landing coming in faster than the Fed expects and the economy starts to crumble underneath their feet. And if you are curious how I'm investing in order to not have to worry about whether we have inflation or deflation, asset prices go up from here or everything collapses, check out my portfolio allocation mastery course where I teach you how to bulletproof your portfolio, linked in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.